رندا عبد الفتاح. رندا عبد الفتاح محامية أسترالية من أصل مصري فلسطيني، والدها فلسطيني ووالدتها مصرية. هي مولودة في أستراليا وطول عمرها بتكتب بالإنجليزية. أصدرت 3 كتب حتى الآن للنشر، وكلهم كسبوا جوائز وباعوا مبيعات جيدة جدا، وبتعتبر من أهم كاتبات النشء في أستراليا. كتابها الجديد اللي لسه صادر واللي احنا أصدرنا ترجمته باللغة العربية اسمه حينما كان للشوارع أسماء، وهو عن جدة فلسطينية تعيش بالأردن وفي أيامها الأخيرة، وكان أملها إنها تشوف أو تشم تراب قريتها تاني في فلسطين. فأحفادها عشان يساعدوها بيعملوا مغامرة وبيعدوا من الأردن يخشوا فلسطين، يحاولوا يجيبوا لها حفنة من تراب بلدتها لكي يساعدوا جدتهم في أيامها الأخيرة. وبترك المسرح لرندا.
I was born in Australia, أبوي فلسطيني، أمي مصرية. And I grew up in Australia understanding my identity was mixed. But of course it could be confusing, and as a way of dealing with that confusion, I turned to writing. And when I was 15 years old, I wrote my first book, which became the first published book about 9 years later. And it dealt with issues of identity for a young Australian Muslim Palestinian girl. And my first 2 books were very much based on my own life and enjoyed much success because people were very curious as to what the Australian Muslim Arabic experience was. Because of course in television, every time you hear about Arabs and Muslims, it was very often a negative image of Arabs as terrorists, people who were aggressive, and Muslim women as always having no rights. So people were very curious to read a very different narrative, a very different presentation of what it meant to be an Australian Muslim Arab. I then turned to write my 3rd book, and في السنة 2000 أمي أبويا وأختي زرنا فلسطين. كان أول مرة لي وأول مرة لأبويا بعد غيابه 35 سنة، والرحلة غيرت حياتي. I've always been involved in human rights work. I'm a lawyer as well, so I've always used my law and my writing skills to raise awareness about what's happening for Palestine. But that trip, أنا شفت لوحدي الظلم، إزاي الناس ما قدرش يعيشوا تحت الاحتلال. أنا شفت التشيك بوينتس and رجعت أستراليا مصممة أعمل حاجة أغير تفكير الناس عن الاحتلال, because very often people in the West in particular, they don't understand. They think that Israel is the victim and that Palestinians are the aggressors, and it's very much a case of ignorance. And because the Israeli propaganda machine is so strong, and that's why I felt very strongly that as an Australian من أصل فلسطين ومصر, I had a responsibility to change people's hearts and minds. Now, of course, if I was going to write a book that told about the suffering of Palestinians and the injustice and the bloodshed, no one would read it, طبعا, because people are sick of seeing these things. They see it on television all the time. And what happens is people shut off. It's much easier to ignore that kind of suffering because it allows you to continue with your life guilt-free. And so I believe very strongly that the way that you reach people's hearts and تغيري أفكارهم is you have to use humor. If you make somebody laugh, you immediately have a connection with them. And that was my strategy. And it wasn't hard, because even for Palestine, when we went on our trip, there were moments of real humor and comedy. For example, we were at the checkpoint Marra, and we were stuck in this little service, and this man kept burping onion and garlic, and it was disgusting. And all of us in the bus كنا بنشتمه and not the Israeli soldiers يعني for him to stop burping his tom were bustle. And I thought later when I got back, you know, I should have been directing my anger at the soldiers who were making us wait at the checkpoint, and here we were all telling this man off and he's like "Hella anni." It was a really funny moment. Another time is I'm competing with the cars here. It's very Another time was I like to talk to children. My books usually have lots of children and young people. And when we were kunna fi Beit Lahm, I used to try and speak to children about their experiences. And once I met two children and I said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And I used this scene in my book. And one of them said, "I want to be a zookeeper, but I want a zoo without cages. The animals, yani, they don't have cages." And so the other boy, I thought, oh, that's very nice, and it could be a metaphor for a Palestinian who wants to live in a world without cages. But they got into a really big fight because this boy was insisting that you can't have a zoo without cages, the animals will eat the trainer. And so in front of my eyes, they keep fighting about this word called safari. And she's saying it's like a safari in South Africa, and huwa musammim, it's sarafi. And they're fighting, and in the end they concluded that anyway the animals will be allowed through the checkpoints by the Israeli soldiers, but the trainers will not be allowed in, so what's the point? And I thought it was a very sweet example of how children, really, you could put them in any situation in the world and children will be children. And this is what I wanted to talk about in this book. I didn't want to approach the book, you know, if I had written a book that was all horror and injustice, no one will read it. But what I do is I focus on the little things in life. I focus on what happens in everyday families, which is often brothers and sisters fighting, mums and dads screaming at each other. You know, in this case, they live in a small apartment in Bethlehem because their land is confiscated. And so they're all stuck in this little apartment. And Hayat, the main character, she's 13, she sleeps in one room with her grandmother, her brother and her sister. And her sister is getting married and she's completely in love, and Hayat, yani, she's so sick of her sister talking about her fiance and always on a diet and trying to do exercises to lose weight. And her grandmother always just constantly all day long farts in the room, wherever she is she farts, and she hates being in this bedroom stuck with her because the grandmother loves eating mansaf, and so all night long she's farting, but she's stuck in this room with her. And so the book is really about just the ordinary things in life. The main thing is that Hayat's grandmother falls sick, and Hayat decides that she wants to go from the West Bank, Bethlehem, to Jerusalem. But taban, she can't go because she's illegal. She's only from the West Bank. So she decides that she's going to try and cross to Israel illegally. So she asks her best friend Sammy. And again, you know, Sammy immediately says yes. Not because he thinks this is a chance for me to, you know, fight injustice and bring back some happiness to Hayat's grandmother. He just wants to skip school because Ustaz Hani has bad breath and is always yelling at him. So he thinks that's a good chance for me to take a day off school. And so the whole book deals with their journey, their adventure. I think, Saad, how far is Bethlehem from Jerusalem? 8 kilometers? Yeah, but of course because of the checkpoints and the separation wall, it's an absolutely terrible situation for them. But the book is really, it tells this situation from a funny perspective. And I did that deliberately because no one's going to read it otherwise. And also because, like Saad and I, we keep saying the same thing, that, you know, what comes from the heart goes to the heart. And we're both very similar in that way. We like to use humour to reach people's hearts.